In this presentation, we're going to be discussing the cosmic conflict theodicy as a response to the existence of suffering and evil in the world. So first of all, a theodicy is an attempt to respond to the question of how an all-loving, all-powerful God can allow suffering to exist. The question and the topic transcends Christianity. Basically, it's a question everyone has asked since the beginning of time. Is there a God? If God is good, why is there so much suffering in the world and things like that? And people have tried to make sense of this question and respond to it in one way or another. Now, there's basically two components to pretty much any theodicy. One component is a rational component, and another one is a theological component. The rational component is something that people can come up with irrespective of religion, and it's universal. In other words, people from many different perspectives could arrive at the same rational construct. But then there's a theological component, which is religion specific. So the same rational component can be taken up by Jewish people, by Muslims, by Christians, and then it could be developed within each group's unique theology, but the core, the rational essence could be more or less the same. And the issue of theodicy has been discussed at length for millennia. So there's a ton of literature on it. Basically, every religion has their own version, their own approach to it, many different approaches, sometimes even within the same religion. So there's a lot that has already been said on the topic. We're not discussing something new or trying to come up with something unique here. Okay, so one of the easiest ways to present the various types of theology is by starting with the Epicurean trilemma. And I have a summary of it here that's written kind of in a more poetic form. I believe David Hume is the one that came up with this version, but I'm not totally sure. But basically, a theodicy has three legs. It has to address three elements. If God is omnipotent, all powerful, and if God is omnibenevolent, so all loving, how is it possible that suffering exists? Those are the three legs: omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and suffering. So this is how the question is phrased. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence comes evil? And is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Okay, so there's generally three types of responses to this Epicurean trilemma. And the first category is the non-answer response, which basically is just, one way to say it is we don't know. We don't know why an all-powerful, all-loving God allows suffering to exist. It's a mystery. It's behind human comprehension, those kinds of answers. Or somebody might say, no, this is not a question that needs an answer. It's not relevant. We don't need to get involved in those kinds of questions. Or somebody might go further and say it's blasphemous to try to respond to these types of questions because we're stepping into mysteries that only God can understand, and so on. And one of the reasons people will take this approach is because they might feel that it's better to say we don't know than to come up with a bad response to suffering that somehow ends up making God look bad. Okay, so that's one way to address the question of to address the Epicurean trilemma. Another approach, I call it the category 2 approach, is a two-legged approach. And this approach tries to resolve the issue by only addressing two of the three legs of the trilemma. So somebody might argue that God is not exactly all powerful, or maybe God is not all loving, or maybe even suffering doesn't actually exist. So somebody coming maybe from the Buddhist perspective might argue that suffering is not a tangible thing. It's rather that we have desires, and then because of those desires, we suffer when we don't get what we want, that kind of thing. So all these are ways to get around this trilemma by addressing two of the legs without dealing with the third. So sometimes people say, well, maybe God is too great to care about human issues. We're too small in comparison to God for him to take notice of us and deal with our problems. Or maybe God is an apersonal being. He doesn't really relate to us the way we would relate to each other. Or maybe God is really strict, so he has certain requirements in place, and because we have free will, we're the ones that stepped out of God's particular pathways that he set up for us, and we're suffering as a result of our own choice, and there's nothing God can do because God only operates within those parameters. Or maybe God, for whatever reason, lacks the capacity to intervene. He doesn't have sufficient power, or whatever. All these are two-legged responses to a theodicy. And people that take this approach rationalize it as saying, well, it's better to address two legs of the trilemma than to address none of them, like the category 1 people who just say, we don't know. They feel that it's better to give some attempt at a response than not to respond at all. While the other people will say, rather than give a bad response, let's just say we don't know. So those are the kind of the two inferior options here. And the third category is a true theodicy, which is one that attempts to address all three legs of this trilemma and to reconcile them. And if such a theodicy exists, it's actually superior to the other two, because it actually resolves this problem in a way that reconciles all the components. Okay, so what are some theodicies that do attempt to address all three legs of this trilemma? Okay, so the first one is known as the soul-making theodicy. And the idea here is that evil exists for us to develop character. So basically, if we don't face any hardships, if we don't have any problems, we never grow, we never mature, we never develop as intelligent beings. So we need obstacles in our way that we need to overcome in order to grow. So that's one explanation for why there is such a thing as evil and suffering in the world. And there is some value to this. I mean, sure, we can understand why facing various hardships can help us develop as individuals. It doesn't explain the degree of suffering that we have in our world. In other words, we can imagine a world that has far less suffering and a much more limited type of suffering. So it only suffering and evil and all the bad things in the world only happen within a very limited sphere, and we would still have the same amount of growth and maturity that we have today, and we wouldn't need to see so much pain and suffering as we do. So this theodicy is obviously limited. And the other problem with this theodicy is that it implies that evil is a necessity. So basically, evil is a required component of reality, because without it, people wouldn't be able to grow, they wouldn't be able to mature, and things like that, which isn't exactly clear. I mean, we could possibly imagine a reality where there's other ways for us to grow and develop without having to experience the kind of suffering we experience in our world. So anyway, this is a type of theodicy that's available. It attempts to address all three legs of the trilemma, but it's a limited theodicy, and it doesn't really answer the question fully. Okay, the other popular theodicy is the free will theodicy, and the idea here is that if God creates beings that have free will, it would be contradictory to prevent them from exercising that free will. And if it turns out that in the process of exercising one's free will, the choices the individual makes produce suffering, it seems only normal that God would allow the individual to experience the consequences of their choices. So in that sense, it is usually considered that this theodicy at least resolves the logical problem of evil. In other words, we can imagine a scenario where an all-loving, all-powerful God would allow evil to exist if it is freely chosen by a being that's capable of making that choice. Now, there's some implications of this type of theology. Uh, there's a certain way to think about evil and suffering, and we need to think of it in terms of it being natural consequences of wrongful acts. So basically, the nature of reality is such that um, the beings that exist within this reality have certain ways that they need to behave, and when they don't follow those patterns, there's consequences that are detrimental. So, for example, to give an example from natural law, so we take the law of gravity. um, Gravity is extremely useful within our universe. I mean, it keeps the planets in place. It keeps us from flying off the Earth and things like that. But at the same time, if somebody jumps off a building because of gravity, they could end up killing themselves or hurting themselves. So the same law that has a lot of positive effects can also have negative effects. Now, somebody might say, well, why couldn't God create a universe where gravity doesn't hurt people? And you jump off a building and you just float naturally to the ground. But even if that is the case, there would be other consequences. So, for example, we might be on a planet like the moon, not a planet, but when you're on the moon, you could jump up pretty high and you don't hurt yourself coming down. But there's consequences of that kind of a world. Or if God created a world or a universe that didn't have gravity, there would have to be some other logic to how that universe works. So, there'll be some other way to keep things together and to make it possible for beings to exist within that universe. And whatever those requirements or those rules are, there'll be consequences for breaking them. So, in order for the rules to actually have a positive effect, they end up having a negative. They could have a negative effect if broken. And the same thing could be applicable to intelligent beings that exist within a social environment, and they have to interact with each other and things like that. So there needs to be a change of how we think about the nature of reality and the nature of what a law is. So basically, a law is uh, God telling us the correct way to exist within our reality, and what patterns to or what behaviors to avoid that are detrimental. So basically, if we look at things from this angle, then there's a certain aspect to how reality operates. And there has to be some kind of instruction manual so that we don't make mistakes, like, we jump off a building because we don't know gravity exists. And then we should be creative with the capacity to follow these rules or laws or in this instruction manual that applies to how reality operates. And then if we don't follow this, if we do have the capacity to follow it, but then we make a conscious choice not to follow it, then there's got to be consequences, and the consequences could be personal, like we could hurt ourselves, or we could hurt others, or there could be consequences for like corporate consequences for the entire social, for the whole community. And in those situations, you have the question of fairness. So, how exactly is God going to react if, say, you have a community where some free-willed individuals make bad choices that harm other people, and do they get away with it? How does it affect the innocent, and all these different questions that come out from this kind of a scenario that is developed around the idea of free will. Okay, so the free will theodicy does seem to have promise in resolving some of the issues about how we can explain the existence of suffering, but it doesn't go far enough, because, for example, it doesn't really explain why the innocent have to suffer or why God allows the innocent to suffer. So maybe somebody has free will and they make a bad choice, and in the process of making that bad choice, they end up hurting somebody else who's innocent. That might happen, but then why would God allow that to continue? And why is it that in our world we have babies that suffer, who haven't done anything wrong and things like that? And then also the extent of the suffering. Why is it that we have as much suffering and evil and pain that we do within our world? So all these questions, the free will theodicy takes steps towards addressing, but doesn't fully address. So this is also not a complete theological model. Okay, so finally we have the third approach, which is the one I'm presenting in this video, which is what I call the modified free will approach. And the idea here is that a good, all-powerful, all-loving God could allow evil to exist temporarily in such a way that if a community of beings makes a choice to go a different direction and to not live according to the sort of owner's manual or the way reality was created by God, and they choose to go their own way, God could step back and allow this evil to exist for some period of time, just so that all these beings can have an understanding of why this is a bad idea, and then God will step in and put an end to it, and never there will never be a need for it again. So God can use this sort of a demonstration or a lesson book, or however you want to call it, as a way to deter evil from ever coming up again, and free willed individuals from ever choosing that route again for the rest of eternity. So God steps back and allows evil to exist for some period of time. People and the beings that exist within this environment, they experience the consequences of evil, and they experience suffering and all the effects that evil can produce, and having made the wrong choices, all the ramifications and the ripple effects. And the idea is that he will allow it for some period of time and then put an end to it. And anybody that realizes that this is bad will willfully choose never to go that route again. Plus the fact that there's a legal precedent now for God to step in the future. So, for example, like before any being has a sense of the consequences of evil, if God had punished somebody for doing something wrong, um, everyone else would say, okay, was that a fair punishment? We don't really know what the consequences would have been. We don't know what the effects are, but now everybody has had a chance to see the effects. And then if somebody decides to go that route again, there's a legal context within which they could actually be punished, and um, evil can be prevented from happening again for the rest of eternity. So within this context, this modified free will approach offers an answer to the question of evil that other theological approaches are not really capable of addressing. So this approach can explain why God would allow even the innocent and gratuitous suffering that we experience in our world, suffering of children, suffering of innocent people, suffering of animals that haven't done anything wrong or are have the self-awareness to make a conscious free will decision and things like that. And yet all these individuals and beings and creatures experience suffering. And it seems like there's no reason for it, but within this context, it makes sense because God is just allowing this period of time, however long it is, within which evil exists. And then once he puts an end to it, he knows, and the rest of the universe knows that it's not going to happen again because nobody's going to want to take that route again. Okay, this approach to theodicy even explains the presence of horrific evil, things like the Holocaust, because it is only if God allows this to happen ever so often. On rare occasion, he allows evil to go to an extreme, because these are the ultimate consequences of allowing evil to exist, and intelligent beings need to understand where evil ultimately leads. Now, we don't live in a world where we've experienced the full effects of evil. In other words, we can imagine a world that is much more horrific than the world we live in. We could imagine a world where from the moment you are born until the moment you die 100 years later, you're in constant pain and suffering, and you're constantly struggling to survive, but for whatever reason you cannot die. And like we could imagine a reality that is much more evil than the one we live in. But even within our reality, God needs to allow the occasional experiences of horrific evil, because these are the actual consequences of sin and taking this route. So in other words, this modified free will theodicy is robust enough to address our present reality, the reality that we live in within this world. And the question, of course, is once God puts an end to evil within this world, if if history continues beyond that, we don't know what new iterations of evil that intelligent beings could come up with in the future. So God needs to allow time for sufficient data to be gathered within this particular history to address all the possible iterations of evil that might arise throughout eternity, and maybe step in forcefully to put an end to evil if it ever shows up again, and if free will beings ever choose that route again, without in the process alienating observers who might say, well, why is God punishing this person? Because it didn't seem like they've done something that terribly bad. But after this demonstration, everybody will know the consequences and where things end up if God permits for this to exist. Okay, so one of the main questions somebody will have with the modified free will theodicy is to say, well, even if this works, why is there such an extent and a degree of evil like what we have in our world? Like, why is it that history has lasted this many thousands of years, and why is it that we need such a long demonstration and such a high degree of evil to take place before God says, we've seen enough? So some of the reasons for this are simply that things need time to unfold, and we need time to see the ripple effects. So sometimes, it takes centuries for different pathways to develop in history. So, somebody does something, or, a nation does something here, and then there are consequences and ripple effects that develop over centuries after that. And then somebody does something else. So, within human history, sometimes we see history develop over many, many centuries, and we see events and decisions that have taken place at one point that have an impact for many centuries to follow. And even within the Christian context, we have as I mentioned before in other presentations, we have, for example, the Catholic Church developing within, after the first few hundred years, and having this massive influence within Western Europe. And then we have the Protestant Reformation almost 1,000 years later. So it took basically a whole 1,000 years for society to get to the point where it was ripe enough to kind of fight back against the control of the Catholic Church. And then the Protestant Reformation was able to take place and to establish itself, and to have support from the various nations of Europe. And then after that took place, there was another. It's been almost 500 years within which Protestantism developed to its present state. So all these things take time, and God has to step back and allow history to unfold, so we could look back and see what are the long-term consequences of any particular trajectory that history takes. Okay, now another reason for why God could allow this degree of suffering and allow suffering to exist for so long within our world, we can address this using an analogy from science. So right now, as I'm recording this, we've just come out from several years of having to deal with the COVID pandemic. And when scientists were developing the different vaccines to give people for as a way to fight back against COVID, They had to do clinical trials before releasing the vaccine to the public. And I believe that the clinical trials involved as many as close to 50,000 individuals. I've seen different numbers, but somewhere around 50,000 people were used during the clinical trials before the vaccines were released to the public. So somebody like a layperson standing by and looking at this might say, why do we have to wait for 50,000 people to get tested? We need a vaccine now. So some people might argue, hey, we should have had much smaller clinical trials with only 2, 3, 500 people. While another group of people on the other side might say, no, 50,000 people is not enough. Let's wait till they test 500,000 people before I give it to my family because it's just not safe. So pe lay people and observers looking at this could argue both ways. They could say it's not enough or it's too much. But scientists have a fairly good sense looking at the situation and having experience with this kind of things from the past. They have a very good sense of what is a reasonable amount of clinical trials and how many people to use for clinical trials before it's fairly safe to assume that we could take this to the general population. So in the same way, we might say, you know, several thousand years of human history is too much because there's way too much suffering and God could have put an end to history much faster. While somebody else might say, no, that's not fast enough, because if we're talking about the rest of eternity, we should probably have a much longer period of time within which God allows sin to exist, so that we have a sufficiently developed deterrent to make sure that sin doesn't occur again for the rest of history. So we could argue this in both directions, and we have no basis for this. It's only God that could look at things and say, okay, there's a certain amount of time that sin should be allowed to exist, and after that we have sufficient data, and it's safe to put an end to this demonstration and then go back to a type of reality where sin no longer exists and we can be sure that it's not going to happen again. So even though the argument might exist as to, this theodicy not fully explaining the extent and the degree of suffering in the world, a legitimate case can be made that it's justifiable to allow it to go this long, because we don't have a way to know for sure what is adequate for addressing the rest of eternity. Just like, a layperson doesn't know what a clinical trial needs to be in order to be safe to take that vaccine to the rest of the world. Okay, so that more or less describes the theodicy in terms of the rational structure of it. So it's basically a modified free will defense, or a modified free will theodicy, which says that there are free will beings that make choices to do evil, and they suffer the consequences. But it's not just that; it's also that God steps back and allows this state of things to continue for a while as a deterrent against future sin and evil. Okay, so now we've talked about the rational aspect of the theodicy, and now we can introduce the revelation aspect of it. So, like I mentioned before, the rational aspects are universal, so people from any religion can make use of them as an explanation, but the parts that depend on revelation are specific to Christianity. And within Scripture, and within even the Christian tradition, there are two layers to this conflict, where God, within this free will, modified free will paradigm. And the two layers are the human layer and the angelic layer. So basically, the Bible describes this battle between good and evil taking place both among humans and among angels. There's an angel who becomes Satan, and he has his followers. And the idea here is kind of the advocate, prosecutor, defendant situation in a courtroom. So you have within any trial, you have the defendant, but then the defendant has a lawyer, and then the prosecution has their lawyers as well who are opposing things. Now, the lawyers are well versed in the law, and they're well versed in courtroom procedure, while the defendant is basically the one involved in the incident. So in this situation, what we have is basically the angels, and there's angels that remain faithful to God, and another group of angels that rebelled against God with Satan or Lucifer leading them. And the idea is that the angels are coming at this sort of from the perspective of experts who have been within this conflict from the beginning, and they're aware of everything that's going on, and they're trying to make as strong a case as possible for their side of the argument, while humanity exists here in this sort of in this environment that is kind of epistemically handicapped. I mean, we're born here, we don't know exactly what reality is all about. Different people from different parts of the world have different beliefs, and they have different ways of living their lives. So we're in the middle of things, and we're experiencing things, and then we have this groups of angels kind of on both sides of the argument, trying to influence things in one way or the other, and God as well is participating in this debate. So within this context, we can also speculate that there's probably other created civilizations there. And this is mostly because the Bible speaks about angels being ministering spirits. So essentially, angels function more like God's, I don't know, army, or God's, I don't know what the expression would be here, but they're the ones that are kind of doing God's bidding in different settings. And it seems that if a human civilization exists, there might be other civilizations that God has created that have not fallen into sin. The Bible very slightly hints at this in the book of Job, for example, where God has this sort of heavenly council. And there's a few expressions in the New Testament where the Bible talks about principalities and powers. Sometimes it seems that it's referring to angels. Sometimes it seems like it might be somebody else. But there's very little in scripture regarding other possible civilizations besides humanity. But it seems to make sense within this context, because if God is allowing this demonstration to exist, it seems like you wouldn't have the majority of free will beings participating in the demonstration. It seems that it would be sufficient to have an isolated case that everybody else can learn from without actually participating in it. So that's one other component of this cosmic conflict idea. Another component is the idea of divine condescension. So for a lot of classical theists, so I've talked in other contexts about the fact that the majority of Christians, going back to the early church fathers, had a certain perspective about the nature of God, where God was, it was basically, they kind of adopted the Greek perspective of God. And within classical theism, God is kind of very distant and very isolated from creation. So he doesn't really interact or doesn't really put himself at their level. But within the neoclassical perspective, which is the one that I'm advocating, that isn't a problem anymore. And God is actually a lot more personal and is a lot more involved in the existence of the beings that he has created. And in this context, God condescends to the level of his created beings and enters into this debate and into this conflict with Satan, not because he has to, not because he has, it is not some kind of dualism, like a cosmic dualism, like in, let's say, Manichaeism or some other, maybe some Eastern religions where good and evil are exact and equal opposites, where they essentially cannot overcome each other. But God simply condescends to this level so that other created beings can look at the situation and make up their mind for themselves. So because of this, God enters into this conflict with Satan and allows him to do whatever he feels he needs to do in order to make his case, and then God attempts to make his case of the argument. And what this implies is also that there's certain rules of engagement um, that make this conflict fair on both sides, because on one end, God could essentially, Satan wouldn't have a chance against God because God is all powerful, and God could easily manipulate the data if he wanted to. So in order for this demonstration to be fair and to be valid, God kind of has to step back and restrict his own power to some degree. But he also has to restrict Satan's power, because if Satan had it his way, he could easily destroy all humanity if he wanted to. And so there has to be limits on Satan's power. So there's certain rules of engagement, and we sometimes see these throughout Scripture in the way God interacts with humanity and Satan interacts with humanity, and the good angels interact with bad angels and things like that. But it's not always made very clear for us, but we can see hints of this throughout Scripture. Okay, now how has this idea of the cosmic conflict been received overall? Historically, there are hints of this in various writings throughout Christian history. Unfortunately, I don't have the precise location, but I have talked to several theologians that have found indications um, of or hints of this idea of a cosmic conflict within the writings of various theologians um, in the past. Now, one of the biggest problems with this idea of a cosmic conflict is, as I've already mentioned, the conflict with classical theism. Because classical theism has had such an impact on Christian theology, had such an overwhelming impact on Christian theology, it has been kind of a deterrent against this cosmic conflict paradigm, because the God of Plato, the God of Aristotle, and the God of Neoplatonism would never engage into a conflict with Satan the way this cosmic conflict paradigm describes, because the God of Plato and Aristotle are just too grand, they're too far away, they're too separate from creation to ever lower themselves to that level, so to speak. The classical God cannot really condescend to the level of his own creation to engage in a sort of level playing field the way this paradigm presents things. Um, and another reason why it doesn't work within the classical paradigm is that the classical God is the form of the good. So you wouldn't even be able to have a debate on whether God's way is the correct way to do things or whether Satan's way is the correct way to do things, because God is the very standard of right and wrong. So you wouldn't be able to question whether God's way is correct, because you would have no standard to judge it by. So within this rational framework, the cosmic conflict doesn't really work. And because classical theism has had such an impact on Christian theology historically and even within recent history, um, that kind of explains why the idea of this cosmic conflict is not as popular within Christianity as some of the other approaches that exist. Then when we had the Protestant Reformation, Calvinism dominated to a large degree the kind of the intellectual development after the Reformation, and because of the idea of divine sovereignty, that also didn't quite jive with the fact that the cosmic conflict is based on the idea of free will. The way the Reformation happened is that Calvin was the first to have the opportunity to develop a systematic theology of the Reformation or of the Reformed perspective. And because many different countries were trying to follow through and to have a Reformation within their region as well, and they needed some kind of systematic theology so that people could understand the Protestant perspective in contrast with the Catholic perspective, Calvinism had the opportunity to spread a lot faster than other points of view, and because of this, it kind of eclipsed, or it didn't really make room for other approaches to the question. Okay, so more recently, the idea of the cosmic conflict doesn't quite jive with the kind of God we get from within the evolutionary paradigm. So basically, a God that creates over billions of years and allows, complex animals to develop through the survival of the fittest paradigm over 500 million years or so, and then human beings to suffer as they develop for another 100 million years. All this stuff doesn't really work within this cosmic conflict paradigm because there there just wouldn't be a reason for this much suffering and evil to exist. Um, the cosmic conflict works a lot better with the scriptural storyline where you only have a few thousand years of human history, and within that you can justify the continued evil um, for this amount of time, whereas hundreds of millions of years just doesn't quite add up. It doesn't quite work. But in spite of all this issues, all this reasons why this paradigm hasn't been well known and it hasn't been very popular historically, within more recent years, it's actually become fairly well spread and understood, and people seem to more and more people seem to embrace it because especially within apologetics circles, so people that spend a lot of time debating atheists and people from other points of view like that don't really, people that would raise the issue of theodicy, raise the issue of the Epicurean trilemma. It's a lot easier to argue from this perspective as opposed to something like the sovereignty of God, the Calvinist approach, which just says that God determined things this way, and there's no other reason than this is how God wants things, and He wants people to suffer and so on. So this particular view, this cosmic conflict view, has grown in popularity within the past several decades, and it's a lot more widely accepted now than it used to be. Now, a lot of times people look at the cosmic conflict as a theodicy, but it's actually more than just a theodicy, because if somebody accepts this paradigm where the reason why evil and suffering exist is because of this conflict, and where it's this demonstration where God is allowing things to exist so that free will beings will learn and understand why not to choose evil again. This actually becomes kind of a macro hermeneutic for all of Scripture. It becomes a lens through which we can look at all of the whole biblical story, and it kind of ties everything together in Scripture. So it's not just a theodicy, but once a person embraces this, they need to look at it as an overarching narrative, and they need to go back and rethink through the entire biblical theology, looking at it through this paradigm. And not just theology in general, but even the gospel in particular, because now there's a framework for the gospel. Like, we actually have a way of understanding why evil exists, why suffering exists, and what it is that God is trying to do. And then the gospel becomes a solution to the problems that were created by this conflict. And we can understand the gospel from this perspective as well. Now, this is a very brief and quick overview of the cosmic conflict. For somebody that wants to dig into this deeper, I recommend the book called The Theodicy of Love, Cosmic Conflict and the Problem of Evil by John C. Peckham, that can be found on Amazon and anywhere else. So anybody that wants to dig into this, because I understand that my presentation is very surface, very superficial within the amount of time I can put together a video like this. But if somebody wants to dig into this a lot deeper, they can read this book, and it should kind of crystallize the perspective for them as they go through this.